So John, one of the things that's come out of this conference is a sense of optimism about the emerging Asian century. Do you have a sense of optimism?
I think I'd be very optimistic if I was an Asian, part of the Asian century, because I think it's certainly going to happen. I think China and India are going to be very powerful nations, and so is Indonesia and much of Asia, and that people are going to be dragged out of poverty, and they're going to urbanise, and you know, they want a standard of living like ours, and who am I to complain about that? So I think if I was them, I'd be very pleased with the direction it's going and the speed with which it's going. There are obviously problems for them for environmental issues and a whole range of issues. Where we sit in the Western world, I think life is going to be a little bit more uncomfortable because for 300 years we've colonised them. For the last 300 years we've been the kingpin in the world. We've set the rules of engagement. We created the rules of the United Nations. We set up all the... And basically international bodies are controlled by Western countries because they're white and because they're prosperous and because, well, God made it that way. It's going to be different in the next 100 years, and I think we might find that a little uncomfortable to come to terms with a powerful China and a powerful India and a powerful Indonesia sitting on our doorstep. So I think it's exciting, and I think we will come to terms with it, but historically countries have not adjusted to losing their hegemony very easily, and so the most difficult country will be the United States. The hegemonic powers don't easily give up their hegemony, and no matter how rational you are about it, that's not the way the people's feeling. So it might be a little more uncomfortable for Australia because we're sitting in a region where we have to relate to it. It's in our interest to relate to it. It's exciting, but we've got an alliance with the United States, and so where does that sit with all? So it is going to be tricky for us.
As a US ally, do you think it's possible for Australia to straddle the relationship it has with both the United States and also Asia?
I think it's an open question. I'd like to think we can. It requires us to be critical about the relationship, and you know, I've been to many private meetings where there's been senior Australian officials there and senior people from the United States, and we've taken the US people to task about containment of China and that kind of language. That's not how we see it. But it's going to require considerable skills on our behalf to actually manage that relationship. It's not in our interest for China and the United States to come to conflict, whether economically or physically, and it's not in our interest that the United States sees the rise of China and India as being against its interests. And many countries in Southeast Asia see the United States as a counter to China anyway, because they too are worried about. Nobody knows how China will behave when China's in a hegemonic power. We don't know. I mean, will China behave like every other hegemonic power has behaved, or will it be different? We all hope it will be different, but we all fear that they might behave in the same way as any other imperial power behaves. So I still think it's going to be tricky because we're not large, we're never going to be large. We're at best a middle power who's declining relatively to the rest of the region, and we can't afford to get people offside. We've got to be very skillful on our feet and very diplomatic on our feet, and that's not going to be easy for us.
I know you're writing a book on Indonesia. What do you think Australia can do to break down some of the misunderstandings that it has about Indonesia more generally?
I think we do need to have a media which understands Indonesia. Look, democracy is messy in any country, and Indonesia's moved to a democratic society, and it is messy. And we have to understand that Indonesian politicians say things for domestic consumption in the same way that have Australian politicians say things for domestic consumption. And so we need to be able to read that and understand that, that this is part of the argy-bargy going on inside Indonesia as much as the argy-bargy going on is... If you took some of the politicians in Australia's words at face value, you throw your hands up in horror. But it's part of the argy-bargy. So we need to understand that Indonesia is a democratic country with lots of different views and people are arguing them out, and we need to listen to that conversation and understand where people are coming from. So that's important. I'd like to see more Australian students going to Indonesia, and now that the travel restrictions have been changed, it was always crazy, but I understand why it was done, that we need that to happen. So I want people to exchange with each other and realise that Indonesia is not a threat. But the reality is that there's lots of talk about, and there was in the final session, about Australia being Indonesia being our neighbour. I mean, historically, neighbours don't get on with each other. And that neighbours, neighbours in your street are as likely to throw bottles over the fence as they are to fight each other in an environmental court. You tend to have better relations with people who are further away, rather than people who are immediate neighbours. And that's the case in Europe. Immediate neighbours fight each other and squabble with each other. Further away, it's not so bad. So we have to understand, we have to not expect too much from Indonesia and not think of an Indonesia in our image. Indonesia will always do our bidding. So, the leader of the opposition says, well, I'll tow the boat back to Indonesia, and they have to accept it. Well, hang on, mate. They won't any more than you would if they wanted to tow the boats into Australian waters. There needs to be an acceptance of the fact that we can't simply have a continuation of notion because we think this is the way that ought to happen, or we think this is the way we ought to believe or act or whatever it might be. That's the way they do. So we need much more understanding. But the biggest barrier to understanding Indonesia will be what I might call our Islamophobia in Australia. That we are unable to understand the diversity within Islam is as great as the diversity within Christianity. That Jerry Falwell and or the guy Jones who burnt himself down years ago because Armageddon was coming, don't represent Christianity any more than a jihadist does represent Islam. And we need to have a much more nuanced view of Islam in Indonesia so we don't feel threatened by it. And I think that's going to be a very deep educational issue about how we present, and it's going to be very important how the Muslim communities in Australia present themselves in Australia to understand that there's no such thing as a Muslim community any more than there's a Christian community. There are Christian communities and Muslim communities who have multiple identities, so that just as I'm an Anglican, I'm also an Australian, I'm also a male, I'm also I have multiple identities. So, and we need to understand that. So I think that's going to be one of the great difficulties we've got in trying to understand that the subtleties and the complexities and the diversity of a country like Indonesia. That's not. One Indonesian said to me years and years ago, Jody said, you've got to remember, you colonised us. We didn't colonise you. And that's a very pertinent point, that we collectively as a Western world colonised the non-Western world. And there's a great deal of still resentment, and we're still paying a price for that. So that we need to come to terms with our own past, just in the same way as to, if we're ever going to come to reconciliation in Australia with Indigenous people, we have to accept what we did to them for 200 years. It's not a guilt trip, it's not that, but it's actually acknowledging face value that we colonised them, we tried to wipe out their culture, we didn't respect them. I acknowledge that, I'm going to move on. And I think in Indonesia terms, we've got to say, well, we colonised collectively them, we don't understand Islam, we don't understand it. We're going to try and move on from that by trying to get a deeper and personal understanding of them. And that's really tricky, it's really hard. Because the media has my phone number, they constantly ring me about, will I comment on X, Y, or Z program about terrorism? I said, look, I'm not a terrorism expert. I don't even know a single one in Australia. There isn't one. But if you want somebody to talk about Indonesia or India or China, I know the people who talk about them. They say, we need a terrorism expert. I said, there is no such thing. There are people who have expertise on a country and will be able to explain this in context. But the academic life is as fickle and faddish as any other life. And an awful lot of people have set themselves up as terrorism experts. Now, I think that just plays into the hands of those who are frightened about Asia and Australia. The biggest single issue facing the Western world is not terrorism. It's absurd. The prospects of me being hit by a terrorist in any form, shape or form is considerably less than the prospect of me having a car crash on the way home. There are much bigger issues about the economy, about social justice, about inequality, about environmental issues. So I guess I wish to focus and move away from terrorism, let alone the concept of the war on terrorism. It's about as silly as the war on drugs. There isn't a war. If you put it in those terms, you're going to lose, however you define winning or losing. So I just wish we would focus on other things. That most Indonesians aren't terrorists. Most Indonesians loathe the people who use violence as much as we do. So let's try and understand that to be a Muslim is not to be a terrorist. There are problems within the Islamic communities that the people inside those communities are as well aware as we are. But what I sort of want us to move away from is this kind of signification of the other as a terrorist, in the same way signify them as being an Oriental. It makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. There are more important issues. And then with strategic studies, I mean, my greatest fear coming out of the Henry Review and sort of look at Australia's place in Asia is that somehow we think strategic studies, which is a euphemism for how do we build up arms and keep the little buggers at bay, becomes a critical issue, and it's not. Yes, it is an issue. Yes, of course you have armed forces. Yes, of course professional armies do it. But paradoxically, in 1997, 1998, when Indonesia was falling apart, the Suharto regime was falling apart, it was the relationships between the Australian Defence Department and the military in Indonesia that saved quite significant issues. We had, on the night when we knew there might have been a coup in Indonesia, for example, we knew overnight, our military were in contact with their military to talk about it, and we got permission to move our ships into Indonesian territorial waters because they've been to army school together and they say, yeah, sure, we understand what you're doing. So we had our ships off in actually Indonesian territorial waters in case we had to rescue people. That seems to me to be a sensible thing to do. But the problem with strategic studies, it sets up an academic discourse which assumes there is an enemy out there, and that's the most important thing. I'd much rather see our focus be on other things to see what are the positive things that we might come out, and what are the way we need to change the way we deal with the region, rather than just simply focusing on short-term fears.